Today we're going to talk about price discrimination. Price discrimination is a pricing policy when a producer charges different prices to different consumers for the same product. There is no difference in the cost of production in producing the product. Now there are three types of price discrimination. We have first-degree price discrimination, second-degree price discrimination, and third-degree price discrimination. With first-degree price discrimination, the producer charges each consumer the maximum price the consumer is willing to pay for the product. With the second-degree price discrimination, the producer charges each consumer different prices for different quantities of the product they purchase. With third-degree price discrimination, the producer charges each consumer based on their price elasticity of demand. Now we're going to talk about the conditions for price discrimination. There are three main conditions. First, the consumers can relatively be easily identified. Second, the producer has market power, which means the producer has the ability to raise the price without losing all the demand for the product. Third, the product cannot be resold from one consumer to another. Before moving on and discussing price discrimination graphs, first we need to understand consumer surplus and producer surplus. In the graph below, we can see consumer surplus highlighted in yellow and producer surplus highlighted in blue. But to really understand consumer and producer surplus, we need to understand what the demand curve and supply curve really mean. First, let's start with the demand curve. The demand curve represents the maximum price consumers are willing to pay for each unit of a product. The supply curve, on the other hand, represents the minimum price or the lowest price producers are willing to accept per unit of their good or product. So let's dive deeper into what consumer surplus really means. Consumer surplus is bounded above by the demand curve and below by P star, or the market equilibrium price. So consumer surplus really measures the difference between the demand curve, or the maximum price consumers are willing to pay, and P star, the equilibrium price, which is the price consumers pay for the good. In essence, consumer surplus is the difference between the consumer's maximum price they are willing to pay and the price they actually pay for the good or product. Now let's take that logic and apply it to producer surplus. Producer surplus is bounded below by the supply curve and above by P star, or the market equilibrium price. So what does producer surplus really mean? It's the difference between the price producers receive in the exchange with the consumers for the good and the lowest price at which producers are willing to sell their product. So let's break this down again. Producer surplus is the difference between the price producers receive and the lowest price at which they're willing to sell, while consumer surplus is the difference between the maximum price at which consumers are willing to spend for the product and the price they actually spend for the product. So let's take a look at a market with a single price. First, we need to take a look and find where our equilibrium point is. We find that that's the intersection between the supply and the demand curve, as the supply curve equals marginal cost and the demand curve equals marginal revenue. Remember that firms maximize their profit when marginal revenue equals marginal cost. In this case, that happens to be the intersection between the supply and demand curves. Thus, the market equilibrium price is P star and the equilibrium quantity is Q star. Thus, consumers will pay the price of P star for the good, while producers will receive the price of P star for that same good. In this market, we have no price discrimination, as every consumer pays the same price of P star. Thus, our consumer surplus is represented by the yellow shaded triangle, labeled CS for consumer surplus. Note that this is the area between the demand curve and the market equilibrium price. Remember that consumer surplus is the difference between the consumer's willingness to pay for the product and the price they actually pay for the product. So the demand curve shows the amount of money the consumer is willing to pay for the product, while they actually only pay P star to get the product. Let's look at the producer surplus, represented in the green shaded triangle, labeled PS. We can observe that it's the difference between the supply curve and the market equilibrium price. Remember that the supply curve actually shows the lowest price that producers are willing to accept for their good. Now, in this market, producers accept the price of P star. Now, the difference between the supply curve and P star, or the market equilibrium price, is the surplus that the producers gain. Thus, it's labeled PS for producer surplus. Now let's take a look at first-degree price discrimination. Remember, first-degree price discrimination is when the producer charges the consumer its maximum price the consumer is willing to pay for the product. Now let's take a look at the graph below. You'll notice that there is no longer any consumer surplus. Remember that consumer surplus is the difference between the consumer's maximum price it's willing to pay and the price that they actually pay. Now, when those two prices are the same, there will be no consumer surplus. Remember that the demand curve represents the maximum price consumers are willing to pay for the product. When consumers end up paying that same price for the product, there is no longer any consumer surplus. Now, the reason the producer surplus takes over that area that used to be consumer surplus is because the price producers receive is no longer P star, or the equilibrium price. Now the producers receive the maximum price consumers are willing to pay, which is represented by the demand curve. That means that producer surplus will be bounded above by the demand curve. At the same time, producer surplus is bounded below by the supply curve because the supply curve represents the lowest price that the producers are going to accept for their product. Now let's take a look at second-degree price discrimination. Remember that second-degree price discrimination is when the producer charges the consumer a different price based on the quantity that the consumer buys. We can see in the graph below that when the producer demands Q1, they are charged a price of P1. When the consumer demands a quantity of Q2, they pay a price of P2. With the quantity of Q3, they are charged P3. With the quantity of Q4, they're charged P4. So we can see that as the quantity that the consumers demand increases, the price they pay decreases. A good example of this is at stores, when they offer the consumer to pay full price for the first unit, but a decreased price for the second unit. For example, buy one, get 15% off. You have to buy the first product or the first unit at its full price, but you get a discount on the second unit. As your quantity increases, the price you pay decreases. Below, we can see the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. Remember, consumer surplus is the difference between the consumer's willingness to pay and the price they actually pay. So each little yellow triangle represents consumer surplus. because the demand curve, which bounds consumer surplus above, represents the price consumers are willing to pay, while the bottom bound of the consumer surplus is represented by the price that they actually pay for each quantity. Now, producer surplus is the difference between the price that producers are willing to accept for their good, which is why the supply curve bounds producer surplus below, while price, which is the price that producers actually receive for each given quantity of the good, bounds producer surplus above. As we can see, the consumer surplus stays the same. In this case, each incremental increase in quantity results in the same incremental decrease in price. That is why consumer surplus looks congruent between all of the different quantities. Now let's take a look at third-degree price discrimination. Remember that third-degree price discrimination is when the producer charges the consumer a different price based on the consumer's price elasticity of demand. Below, we can see two graphs. On the left is consumers with less elastic demand because of its steeper demand curve. On the right, we have consumers with more elastic demand given its flatter demand curve. Now let's just say this producer has a constant marginal cost, regardless of the consumer's demand. So, we represent marginal cost as a flat horizontal line. Now remember, where does a firm maximize its profit? A firm maximizes its profit when marginal cost, or MC, equals marginal revenue, MR. Now, because the slopes of the demand curve are different based on the price elasticity of demand, the marginal revenue curve will also have different slopes. So, for consumers with less elastic demand, the profit maximizing quantity is at QA. For consumers with more elastic demand, the profit maximizing quantity is at QB. The corresponding prices for these two quantities is PA for less elastic demand and PB for more elastic demand. Now, based on these differences in price, we can see that the area for consumer surplus and producer surplus also changes. For consumers with less elastic demand, the price consumers pay is PA, which is why consumer surplus is bounded above by the demand curve dA and below by the market equilibrium price of PA. Now remember that marginal cost also equals supply. That means that the marginal cost also represents the lowest price producers are willing to accept for their good, which is exactly why producer surplus is bounded above by the market equilibrium price and below by the marginal cost curve. For consumers with less elastic demand, producer surplus is bounded by PA and MC. The same exact case happens with consumers with more elastic demand. Consumer surplus is again bounded above by the demand curve, represented by DB, and below by the market equilibrium price of PB. Notice that the price between the two consumer groups are different. PA is greater than PB. Again, the producer surplus is bounded above by the market equilibrium price of PB and below by the marginal cost curve, which is the lowest price producers are willing to accept for their good. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.